This is the second lecture for Monday, April 20th. We're talking about the cycling of nutrients through ecosystems. Talked about the disturbance, we talked about water, and now we're on to this second element of carbon. Now, I probably don't have to tell you, but I will anyway, that every major biological macromolecule, that's proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids, and living things in general, organic things, are all based on the structure of carbon. So you learned this in some introductory biology class, that carbon has the ability to form 4 bonds. Carbon is a really diverse, dynamic element in terms of all the different structures that it can form. Now, a lot of you in this class have to take organic chemistry. Some of you in this class take organic chemistry. You take a whole year of organic chemistry. So it's very memorization oriented. You learn all these different compounds that contain carbon, basically. All these organic compounds. That's why it's called organic chemistry. So carbon is very important for living things. Carbon is found in every protein, every carbohydrate, every lipid. There's a huge amount of carbon in living things. You need carbon-based materials as a source of energy to eat if you're going to be a living thing, if you're not photosynthesizing. You eat something that contains carbon, you burn that in your cells, and you make ATP with that. That's what cellular energetics and the energy that fuels all living things that are eating something is based on carbon. That's how important carbon is. So we're going to see that there's carbon that's in a couple of different sources. There's carbon in living things. That's organic carbon. Proteins, carbohydrates, lipids that you find in bodies. All of us have a bunch of carbon in our bodies. Now, we're going to die. We're going to be like a leaf that falls to the ground, or a chipmunk that dies. Something goes to the bathroom. There's a bunch of carbon that's not in living things, but it was in living things. A good example of this in terms of the availability of fuel are fossil fuels. Whether you're talking about coal or natural gas or oil, those can all be burned to generate energy in the form of heat or electricity or something, because they're all organic and they all contain these carbon bonds that can be broken. And when those bonds are broken, they liberate energy. That energy can be used in the form of what we fuel our economy with, and cars and ships and trains and our homes. So there's a bunch of carbon in living things. There's a bunch of carbon that's organic still, but not in living things anymore because those things are dead. Sometimes those are cycled back into living things in a short period of time. Sometimes they remain for tens of thousands of years, like fossil fuels. And then there's also a huge amount of carbon in the biosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. In the air, there's a lot of carbon dioxide. In the ocean, there's a lot of carbon dioxide. Now, this is a good source of, this is what plants use, or photosynthetic organisms like phytoplankton. So this carbon dioxide is not a bad thing, as long as there's not too much of it, because this is what photosynthetic organisms take out of the air or take out of the water and join together to make sugars. The energy to do that is derived from ATP, which they make from light energy. So what we're going to see is we're going to look at carbon flowing between organisms. You've got a plant. It's got a bunch of carbon in it that it made, sugar, and that plant gets eaten by a deer. Now that deer has transferred a bunch of carbon from the plant into the deer. The deer is using those carbons to make its own proteins and carbohydrates and lipids. And then the deer gets eaten by a wolf, And the wolf is incorporating those carbons into its own proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. And then the wolf dies and it's decomposed. And those decomposers are taking the carbon out of the wolf and incorporated it into their own proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. So you can imagine transfer of carbon between organisms. That carbon, it's not just being incorporated into those things, but it's especially being used to make ATP, because carbon in that plant, the bonds between carbons can be broken, and that deer is making ATP to fuel its metabolic needs. The wolf that eats that deer is breaking the bonds between carbons from that deer meat and making ATP. All the things that we eat, we're fueling our bodies by breaking those carbons and making ATP. There's also a very large carbon cycle between the oceans and the atmosphere, the air and water. And then on a longer term basis, sometimes hundreds of years, thousands of years, even millions of years, there's carbon that's cycling in geological processes. There's carbon that's not in a living thing. It's not in the air, it's not in the water, but it's in the form of some kind of a rock, basically. So this is what I was talking about before. Carbon dioxide, if you're a photosynthetic organism like a plant or phytoplankton, you take carbon out of the air or out of the water, and you join 1 carbon, 2 carbon, 3 carbons, and you join those 2, 3 carbon molecules together to form a 6 carbon molecule. That's glucose, sugar. That's what photosynthetic organisms do. If you're a deer, you eat that plant, and then you convert that carbon in the plant. You break that down in your cells, the bonds between those carbons, you make ATP. An end product of that, and how this deer loses the carbons that it ate, is in carbon dioxide that it breathes out. And now you've got a mountain lion that eats this deer, the mountain lion taking carbon in that deer meat to make ATP, breathing out the carbons as carbon dioxide. So that's the connection between photosynthesis, which takes carbons out of the atmosphere and joins them together to make sugar, and cellular respiration, which takes that sugar, breaks the bonds between the carbons, and then these animals get rid of that carbon from their bodies in the form of carbon dioxide, which is back into the atmosphere. That's available for the plants. And so around and around it goes. Carbon is fixed by photosynthetic organisms. Carbon is consumed by some consumer. It's broken down, excreted from the bodies as carbon dioxide, which is available for the primary producers. Now, this carbon, in the form of sugars, has hydrogen attached to it, and it has oxygen attached to it as well. Some of these have nitrogen as well, at least in proteins, but that's a whole different nutrient. There's a huge amount of exchange of carbon between the air, where it's carbon dioxide, and between water, especially in the ocean. And the ocean is a huge reservoir for carbon dioxide. The ocean does a very good job of taking carbon dioxide out of the air. It's something that we're concerned with, these greenhouse gases, all the extra carbon dioxide that's produced by fossil fuels being burned, by cars using gas, by coal plants burning coal, by oil consuming things using oil. All of those produce carbon dioxide because all of those are burning some kind of organic molecule that contains carbon. And as the number of humans, the human population, the amount of energy that we use, the amount of carbon dioxide that's pumped into the atmosphere has skyrocketed. There's a huge amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, the ocean can take up a lot of that carbon dioxide. So can plants, but there's a limit as to how much plants can use. But the ocean is a huge source. So this carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean, into the water, but it doesn't stay in the form of carbon dioxide in the ocean. It's converted in this reaction with water itself, with H2O, to form carbonic acid, HCO3. Now, this is a buffer. It can buffer a lot of positive ions. And so that's what happens with carbon. That's how carbon is sequestered in seawater, a huge amount of carbon. So this is there's a diagram that shows this. You've got all this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that's being produced by power plants, it's being produced by cars, it's being breathed out by animals like humans, being breathed out by sheep and cows and all these different sources of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide enters into the ocean, and then the ocean incorporates this carbon dioxide through photosynthetic organisms, but also this reaction that takes place. It's not shown here, but the ocean converts a lot of this carbon dioxide to carbonic acid, that HCO3. There's other organisms that incorporate carbon into their bodies or into their shells, into their skeletons, like coral and things that have shells, like snails or clams. So that's how carbon cycles around in between the atmosphere and the ocean. There's a huge amount of exchange between the ocean. The ocean is very big, so the ocean is capable of taking up a lot of the carbon. And then the last thing that I want to mention is this idea of geological cycles. Now, this is a long-term, in some cases, this is a long-term cycling of carbon, where it's not just a matter of days or minutes, sometimes, like between a plant taking up carbon dioxide. But there's huge deposits of carbon in different forms. There's limestone, calcium carbonate, there's dolomite, there's oil and gas, natural gas, and there's coal, all these different compounds, all these different materials that contain carbon. And if we harvest these, if we dig up the coal from a coal mine, or if we drill for oil, then we speed up the access of that and the return of those carbons to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But if you look at this figure, if you take a minute to look at this figure and you see these different sources of carbon, all of these things have carbon. And you can imagine the time scale by which they cycle. Some of them are long and some of them are short. But these numbers on here show you how much carbon there is in these biogeochemical cycles. So some of this is alive. If you look at the amount of carbon in plants, in bacteria, in animals, dead organic matter, there's a lot of carbon. And if you look at the amount of carbon that's used by bacteria, it's used in water, in the blue here. And then look at the amount of carbon that there is in these sediments, limestone, dolomite. There's a huge amount of carbon there. And this can be incorporated back into some living things. And then there's coal, oil, natural gas, those carbon-containing compounds that we burn produces a lot of carbon dioxide that's cycled back into the atmosphere. So this carbon is a good example of an element, a nutrient, that's found in living things, plants, bacteria, fungi, animals. It's found in terrestrial settings, things that live on land. It's found in aquatic settings. It also has forms that are found in the air, has forms that are found in the water, carbon dioxide. It's not part of a living thing. And it's got forms that are found as part of basically rocks or sediment. Huge amounts of carbon that are in that form as well. So carbon cycles between living things and dead representatives of those living things, dead decaying organic matter that used to be alive, and then eventually it makes its way out of these living things into the air, into the water, into sediments. All right, the next element for us to look at is nitrogen. And somebody might argue this is the most important element. If you're singling out elements, that nitrogen has so many different forms, so much importance in proteins, amino acids, in DNA, RNA, ATP. Nitrogen is really important. Nitrogen is very abundant in the air and in water, and it also has representative forms in the air, in the water, in living things. And so it's a little more complex than what we've looked at before. It's going to take more time to look at nitrogen. So let's begin with this. Spend a few minutes introducing this concept of nitrogen cycling, and then we can end the lecture for this Monday, and we'll spend most of Wednesday talking about nitrogen. So nitrogen in the atmosphere. You know, the atmosphere is something like 80% nitrogen. There's some oxygen, which is important for us, but there's a lot of nitrogen. And as I said, every nucleic acid, every protein, every DNA, every RNA, every ATP has nitrogen. It's very important. But where do we get our nitrogen? We can't take nitrogen out of the air. We can't take nitrogen out of the water and get it into our RNA or DNA. We have to get it from our food. There's some amino acids that we make, and there's some amino acids that these are what are joined together to make proteins. We can make some of our own amino acids. Some other amino acids we have to get from our food. Those are called essential amino acids. And so an important component of these nitrogen cycles that we're going to see again and again and again is bacteria. Bacteria can take nitrogen, can take N2, nitrogen that's in the air, or nitrogen that's in the water, that's in the soil. Bacteria can take nitrogen directly from those sources and incorporate it into their living parts. They can take N2 and make NH3, this elemental nitrogen, N2, and they can convert it to ammonia, NH3. So there's different types of bacteria. There's different conversions of bacteria that are involved in this nitrogen cycle. And we're going to look at 6 of these, 6 different forms of nitrogen. There's gaseous nitrogen, what you find in the air. We breathe it in and out all the time. It doesn't have much influence on us, but it's the major component of air is nitrogen, N2. There's also organic nitrogen in different forms that form all these different macromolecules. There's nitrogen in nucleic acids, proteins, amino acids, as I said, ATP. Those all they're joined together in bonds with carbon as part of organic molecules. But those are found in living things. So it's organic nitrogen. Then there's bacteria that are involved in conversion of gaseous nitrogen into nitrite. There's other bacteria that are involved in conversion to nitrate, NO3. And then there's conversion of nitrogen to ammonia, NH3, as well as ammonium, NH4. Those are all different forms of nitrogen that are found in living things or that are found in non-living things. Now, what we're interested in, what we use all the time, what's really important for us is this organic nitrogen. But see, that's only one of the 6 different forms of nitrogen that we're going to see. So to begin with, this is what we're going to spend our time on for the next lecture on Wednesday, are these different forms of nitrogen. And we're going to see these different conversions of nitrogen from one form to the other. So when we look at this cycling of nitrogen through ecosystems, we're going to see there's nitrogen fixation, which bacteria can do. It's a bunch of bacteria. This is important. All these bacteria that are in symbiotic relationships with the roots of plants, for instance, that have these nitrogen, these bacteria nodules that are on the roots of plants. They're capable of taking nitrogen out of the air and incorporate it into living things. Now, who can do that? Just bacteria. There's also nitrification, which is conversion of ammonia to nitrate, which takes place in this nitrogen cycle. There's assimilation, which is how plants can take up nitrate. They can't take up nitrogen from the atmosphere, but they can take up nitrate and then convert it to organic nitrogen in the form of DNA or RNA or proteins or amino acids. And then there's ammonification, the recycling of organic nitrogen by decomposers. So this plant dies, some animal dies, it's got a bunch of nitrogen in it. Decomposers, especially bacteria, are capable of taking this organic nitrogen in a dead thing and then incorporate it into their bodies. And then there's denitrification, which is where you have the production of all this nitrogen, this gaseous nitrogen that's in the atmosphere. And if that's where it ended, all living things would constantly be losing nitrogen. But that gaseous nitrogen can be reincorporated into living things by bacteria. So those are the different forms of nitrogen that we're going to see. And those are the different processes by which nitrogen is converted from one form to the other. That's what we're going to look at on Wednesday.